the mirror fogged first, breathing my own secret back at me through tiny beads of condensation that blurred the face I thought I knew. I remember thinking, in that slice of impossible time, that the glass was judging me more gently than I had ever learned to judge myself. The house slept around me. The loose floorboard in the hallway that clicked like a metronome, the muffled refrigerator hum, and I'd snuck downstairs with a pair of things that felt like contraband and sanctuary both, folded small in my hands. I didn't imagine a dramatic reveal, no thunderclap of revelation, just the hush of intent and the acute, absurd hope that something would fit, not only my body but the outline of a self I kept sketching in private. Putting them on was clumsy at first. My fingers remembered sports jerseys and work shirts, not the delicate stretch and curve of fabric meant to cup and comfort. My breath quickened not from arousal, but from a newness that felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. When I looked up and saw my reflection properly, jeans, hair in a lazy knot, the panties a soft color that made my cheeks heat, the sight struck me like a sentence I'd always known but never read aloud. I felt childish, criminal, and incandescent at once. The mirror became a confidant. I talked to it because I had to, whispering apologies and explanations that sounded more like invitations. It's okay. This is okay. I traced the line where the fabric met skin, and noticed how my shoulders relaxed, a small surrender to truth. Still, a knot of fear sat at my ribs. I worried about Mom's reaction. Not a stranger's, not a lover's, but the woman who dried my tears after scraped knees and stayed up late when I was sick. Her love had been constant and practical, a patchwork of casseroles and gentle lectures, and I feared that what I was doing would make her patchwork unravel. I thought of all the times I had folded myself to fit expectations. The school uniforms, the team sports, the short haircut that seemed to say, "You belong here." Those memories tightened and then loosened as if the mirror's surface could somehow rearrange the past. When I heard the kitchen light click on upstairs, the hair on my arms rose like a warning. My heart ran a race it did not yet understand, a wild animal sensing an open gate. I should have put everything away, slid the garments back into secrecy and washed my face with normality, but some small voice, braver or stupider than the rest, told me to stay. The footsteps grew closer, not hurried, just the steady, ordinary tread of someone about to make a sandwich or fetch milk. "Who's down there?" Mom called, voice sleepy and ordinary. My mouth felt dry. My immediate impulse was to laugh it off, to offer a banal response and let the moment dissolve, but the reflection in the mirror seemed to plead. "Don't run." The sound of her footsteps on the stairs made time slow. Each step was a chisel of inevitability. I told myself I could invent an explanation. Laundry, a lost sock, a phone that fell. But explanations felt trite and flimsy as tissue. When her shadow filled the doorway, my breath stuttered into a new rhythm. Expectant, exposed. She saw me before I could shape any sentence. There wasn't a cinematic gasp or a raised hand. She simply stood, that same practical woman who once tied my shoelaces, and her eyes slid from my face to the fabric in a way that catalogued rather than condemned. For a suspended second we catalogued each other like strangers in a small museum. Me, a boy in a quiet kitchen with an unfamiliar softness around my hips. Her, the organizer of school lunches and PTA notes, holding a dish towel like armor. The silence between us didn't feel like anger so much as a rare, heavy attention. The first thing she said, and I still hear the exact timbre when I try to replay it, was not an accusation but a question. "Why?" she asked simply, a word that could have been fragile or kind, and in that word was every path I might take. Deny, laugh, confess, disappear. I chose honesty in the most halting way I could manage. "I don't know," I said, because it was true and because it felt less like admitting a fact than offering a confession of feeling. She came forward like someone approaching a small animal, cautious hands out, and I expected a rebuke. Instead, her fingers brushed the mirror, and she looked at the two of us as if trying to see how the reflections lined up. The dish towel fell forgotten at her feet. There was hurt on her face, a small surprised crease, and then a softness I hadn't afforded her because I'd been too afraid to imagine it. She didn't leave the room. She sat on the counter opposite me and said, "Tell me." I began because the mirror had cracked open something that needed air. Words tumbled about curiosity and loneliness, and a secret rehearsal of identity in the dark. I told her about the tiny victories. The first time a skirt fluttered around my knees in a shop window, the secret care with which I smoothed fabric across my thighs at school when no one was looking. My voice frayed and then steadied. Each revelation felt like shedding a heavy sweater. The words landed between us like rain on tin, steady, ordinary, and impossible to ignore. And for a moment there was only the rhythm of our breathing and the faint tick of the wall clock. She listened the way people listen when they love someone enough to risk not having the right answer, palms open but speech measured. As I talked, the mirror kept catching fragments of our exchange. Her profile, my reflection leaning toward the glass. The way the panties hugged a place on my body that felt simultaneously foreign and home. I watched her face map the story. Surprise, concern, a flicker of recognition, perhaps not of my exact truth but of the broader ache that had driven me to hide. She reached for my hand, the gesture ordinary and seismic. Her fingers were warm and habitual. The same hands that had smeared peanut butter on my first sandwiches and tucked notes into my lunchbox. Holding them now felt like a tether to a safety I wasn't sure I deserved. We spoke for a long time. Not in the sharp, accusatory bursts of some imagined confrontation, but in long circling sentences that tried to find the shape of what this meant. She asked practical questions. Have you told anyone else? Do you feel safe? And softer ones too, that stabbed their way into the cavernous private rooms of my mind. Does this feel like you? Each question was a small mirror. Sometimes the answer reflected back with clarity. Other times it was smeared by fear. I admitted that I hadn't told anyone, not because I didn't want to, but because the idea of translating this feeling into words felt like drawing a map of a city I'd only ever seen from the inside. I told her about the ridicule I'd feared, the jokes that could follow, the loss of friendships that sometimes felt conditional on how closely I matched the boy mold. Her face tightened then, a rawness that made me both ache and grate against guilt. I don't want you to get hurt, she said, and I wanted to say I know. But there was another truth that I could not fold away. My fear of hurting her by diverging from the life she had imagined for me. The motif of the mirror threaded through our conversation like punctuation. Every so often the light shifted and we both glanced at it, as if the glass held a verdict. I realized that I had been using the mirror not simply as a reflector of appearance, but as a rehearsal space where I could try on courage. The fabric I wore had become more than clothing. It was a conduit for a voice that had been muted by years of fitting into boxes marked acceptable. In that small, ordinary kitchen, I started to map the possibility of being seen. I confessed the small rituals that fed me. The way I adjusted my neckline when I thought no one watched, the songs that made me want to sway, the way cosmetics felt like painting a version of myself that had always been there, waiting for permission. She surprised me with a question that made me stumble because I hadn't expected her to ask it. What happened when you were younger? Did anything make you feel this way? I thought of dusty family photos and the extra-long smudges of crayon I used on the page when no one was looking, of preferring dolls to trucks in a whisper of memory. I remembered a teacher's offhand joke that labeled me sensitive, and the way I absorbed that label like a coat that never quite fit. I said these things slowly, as if turning a key that had been rusted. Her expression softened and clouded at once. Empathy and the ache of not having noticed grew in equal measure. She said, "If only I had seen it sooner," and it sounded less like blame and more like mourning for time we would never get back. I wanted to tell her that time had been both enemy and companion. The longer the secret lived, the more it became woven into mundane life, harder to pluck out without unpicking everything else. After the conversation, we moved into a quieter zone where practicalities rose like small islands to navigate. Clothing, school, friends, and the lurking question of identity labels that seemed both liberating and confining. She suggested we explore options together. A counselor, perhaps, someone who could translate feelings into language that made sense to both of us. Her suggestion felt like scaffolding. It was a structure I could lean on while learning new ways to stand. For the first time, the word "we" slipped comfortably into the conversation, not as obligation but as partnership. The relief that followed was a tidal thing, washing through me with shiny edges. I laughed then, a small, incredulous sound, because the idea that my secret could be shared without the room collapsing felt almost absurd. She sat with me as I tried on different possible futures, her hand returning to mine at intervals like punctuation. But even as solace settled into the kitchen, fear lurked at the edges. I pictured school hallways like rivers of judgment, imagined friends measuring their laughter against new information. I saw faces rearranging themselves with an almost surgical indifference. The shield of our conversation felt fragile compared to the world outside. I asked her if she was afraid for me. Her answer was honest and simple. Always. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a human reaction. We both recognized that unconditional love does not erase the realities of society. That acknowledgement, though heavy, felt oddly liberating. A realism that allowed us to plan rather than pretend. The mirror, resting against the counter, reflected a small, brave smile I hadn't allowed myself in public. I stood and smoothed the fabric of the panties, performing a ritual of acceptance that felt like both a defiance and a prayer. Mom stood too, and without fanfare she walked to the cabinet and pulled down an old cardboard box, the one with ribbon remnants and letters from my childhood. She opened it, and inside were things that felt like a map of my life. A school play program, a watercolor I'd made that had a girl with red braids, a faded friendship bracelet. She handed me the bracelet, and in that small exchange there was a passing of permission I hadn't known I needed. The bracelet fit loosely on my wrist as if it had been waiting, preserved for some small moment of reckoning. I clenched my hand around it and felt it anchor me to the person I had been and the person I might become. The cardboard box smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil, a scent that tugged at memories like a gentle hand. Later that afternoon, after a quiet lunch of soup and an awkwardly polite silence that felt like a truce, Mom suggested we try a small experiment. We would go shopping for clothes together, not to announce anything but to learn what felt right. My stomach clenched with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Shopping had always been less about garments and more about trying on identities, and now the fitting room would be a stage where possibility and reality met. I agreed, partly because I wanted to prolong the tether she'd offered and partly because I needed to practice being seen in public without crumbling. The mall felt enormous when we stepped inside. A cathedral of glass and fluorescent light that made every reflection sharper. Mirrors multiplied me into dozens of potential selves, and I followed each distorted version like footprints across a stream. Mom's presence gave me a courage that was practical and humble. She navigated racks and sizes with the same sensible efficiency she used for grocery lists, and that steadiness steadied me. We started in an inexpensive boutique she liked, soft fabrics, forgiving cuts. And I watched her pick things not with an expert's eye but with a shopper's curiosity, holding skirts against me as if we were choosing curtains for a room we both wanted to make brighter. Each piece I tried on felt like a small test. A skirt that swished in a way that made me want to move. A blouse whose collar softened my shoulders. A cardigan that made the silhouette I'd avoided all my life suddenly plausible. In the fitting room, the mirror did its old trick of multiplying my doubts and hopes. I stood, turning slowly, noting the way light found new planes on my face. Makeup, which I'd practiced in secret at night, finally had a public audience. I showed Mom how I faded eyeliner to make my eyes seem less surprised and more considered. How a dab of blush could lift a face like a small brushstroke on a weathered painting. She watched with the kind of care that suggested she was learning a language she had not been taught. At one point she reached out and adjusted a stray hair without hesitation, tucking it behind my ear as if this small domestic gesture could declare normalcy. The sensation of her fingers lingering there was a quiet benediction. But the outside world remained unpredictable. A cashier glanced at us in the lane, assigning us a narrative in a second that I could not control. I felt that glance as a tiny disturbance. Later on the bus home, an old neighbor, the kind who remembered everyone's middle names, offered a friendly nod that carried an unspoken question. Those moments stung with possibility. Acceptance seemed attainable, but only in fractions. We began to map strategies for social navigation, which friends might be allies who would need time, which school authorities might require preparation. Mom's practical mind made lists in the margins of a napkin, turning fear into tasks that could be tackled. That small act of organization soothed me more than it should have. Suddenly the unknown was segmented into items we could confront one by one. At night, after we'd put the clothes away and the house settled into its hush, I found myself staring at the mirror again. The bracelet glinted on my wrist, a looping promise. I lay out the new outfits on my bed like flags marking reclaimed territory. My internal monologue, which had been a tangle of doubt, began to form sentences that were less frantic. Maybe this is me, maybe this is a part of me, maybe I can balance both. But old patterns resisted. I felt guilty for finding joy in these clothes. As if pleasure were something I had to ration against the harm my choice might cause my family. There were nights I replayed conversations, practicing alternative answers to questions I had not yet been asked. There were mornings when the fear was so thick I could hardly breathe, and days when confidence felt buoyant and unstoppable. School presented a different set of anxieties. I imagined the locker room as a courtroom, benches of kids whispering verdicts. I rehearsed dialogues, how to tell friends, how to deflect unkindness, whether to preempt gossip with honesty. I also imagined tender possibilities. A friend who would hug me and say nothing more. A teacher who'd offer space. Classmates who would adjust to a new truth, like the weather shifting and then settling. I realized that my fear of rejection was not simply about losing people. It was about losing versions of myself that had been shaped around others' expectations. Comfort and authenticity fought for space in me like siblings arguing over the same chair. One afternoon, emboldened by practice and feeling the residue of Mom's steadying presence, I decided to tell my closest friend, Omar. We'd known each other since primary school, our friendship stitched together with shared math problems and comic book loans. I memorized a route in my body. Breathe twice, find the words, allow silence. The conversation didn't erupt. It unfolded with a cautious curiosity. Omar blinked, processed, and then asked questions that were both simple and profound. Are you the same me? He wanted to know, and I laughed because the honesty of the query was disarming. Yes, I said, finding humor in the plainness. He took a beat and said, You're still my friend. Relief was a physical thing. A softening behind the eyes. An exhale that felt like air after being underwater. But even as we walked away arm in arm, I could see the pattern of him measuring how to talk about me differently, like fabric being hemmed to fit a new shape. It would take time, he said, and I accepted that answer like a gift. That evening the city felt quieter, or maybe I was simply listening differently. Attuned to the small, steady things I'd once ignored. The way streetlights pooled like warm coins, the soft hiss of a neighbor's motorcycle settling, the rhythm of my own steps as if they too were finding a new cadence. The coming days unfolded in increments, each one a miniature test and a tiny triumph. In class, I learned how to answer questions without turning every conversation toward myself. At home, Mom and I developed rituals. A morning nod before school that meant, I see you, and a nightly check-in that asked only, how are you? We kept appointments with a counselor who specialized in identity exploration, a neutral space that helped both of us grow a vocabulary for feelings that had lived in the body without names. The counselor offered phrases that felt like bridges: gender expression, authentic self, boundaries. Those words were not destinations but tools, and we used them carefully, sometimes clumsily, until they fit our mouths. There were setbacks. Once a classmate made a joke in the cafeteria about attention-seeking, and the word lodged in my throat like a stone. I felt the old reflex to shrink, to flatten myself until I matched the outline people expected. Instead I breathed, remembered the way Mom's hand had rested against mine in the kitchen, and answered with a calm I was still learning. I'm not asking for attention. I'm figuring out who I am. The reply shifted the air. Not a victory, not a headline change, but a small writing. Sometimes people needed time to unlearn assumptions, sometimes they never changed. Both truths were heavy and necessary. Identity, I discovered, is less a single reveal than a series of negotiations. There were days when I relished the way a skirt swished as I crossed a street, feeling like a secret poem set to motion. There were other days when I wanted nothing more than to be invisible, to fold back into the safety of anonymity. Each mood was valid, and I learned to grant myself the right to inhabit contradictions. Mom's support sometimes faltered under the weight of societal expectation. She asked questions that betrayed worry about family gossip, or about how relatives might react. Those moments stung because they were not rejections of me so much as reflections of the world she feared. We argued, not loudly, but with the ache of people trying to protect one another in different ways. After one such argument, I retreated to my room and sat in front of the mirror until the familiar fog returned, and I found that my reflection had begun to hold more steady features. The tilt of my chin, the shape of my mouth, the way my eyes settled when I allowed them to be soft. I began to understand that transformation wasn't a single pivot, but a slow alignment, like tuning an instrument until it sounds right. At school, my classmates' curiosity sometimes softened into acceptance. At other times it hardened into distance. I learned to read microsignals. Who would cross the street to say hello? Who would avoid meetups? Who would keep me in the same orbit but with a slightly altered trajectory? Friendship took on a craftsmanship. Sometimes you had to sand rough edges, sometimes reshape expectations, sometimes let a piece fall away so the rest could hold. Omar remained a steady presence, his humor a buoy I could rely on. He asked questions that were sometimes clumsy and sometimes beautiful, like a person learning a new language and eager not to make the same mistakes. His willingness to try, to call me by the name I preferred when I asked, to defend me quietly when someone laughed, mattered more than grand gestures. A recurring motif of the mirror evolved. It was no longer just a surface to practice on but an archive of my progress. I started a ritual. Once a week I would stand before it and speak aloud the things I feared and the things I dared to hope. I kept a small sticky note at the corner of the glass with a single phrase Mom had said in the first weeks after she found out. "You are my child." It was a simple sentence, embroidered now with layers of meaning, and each time I saw it I felt the shape of home expand a fraction more. Sometimes I would tape other notes around it. A line from a song that made me brave. A doodle from childhood that reminded me I had always loved color. A tiny photograph of Mom and me at the beach where the sun had flattened our shadows together. Those small relics turned the mirror into a map of memory and promise. Months passed, and with them the worst of the rawest shocks faded into an ordinary life that contained new realities. Mom came with me to a local support group meeting once, holding my hand in the foyer like a quiet ally. In the meeting room we heard other stories that echoed and diverged from ours. People who had chosen different paths, parents who had faltered and learned, young people whose courage felt like clarifying light. Listening to those voices, I felt less singular, less like an anomaly, and more part of a current that moved people toward authenticity in their own rhythms. The experience did not erase fear, but it taught me the currency of community. One afternoon, walking home, I reached into my pocket and found the bracelet Mom had handed me back in the kitchen. It had acquired faint scratches and the ribbon frayed at the edges, a testament to being worn. I rolled it between my fingers and thought about how small acts of acceptance could alter the course of a life. That night, Mom and I cooked dinner together, a domestic choreography we'd always shared, and we paused over the sink amid steam and dripping vegetables. She turned and said, almost offhand, "I met your teacher last week. They seemed supportive." The word was measured, but it contained the weight of a new reality. I smiled and replied, "That means a lot." The exchange was ordinary and profound in the same breath. There were quieter moments of joy that felt like private sonnets. Trying on a dress for the first time in a shop without the fluorescent glare of fear, catching my reflection in a cafe window and liking the person staring back, receiving a message from a distant cousin that read, "I'm proud of you," and feeling the sentence land like sunlight. Each of these moments accumulated, slow deposits that built a life that felt more whole. Yet I never stopped practicing humility about the costs of visibility. Being seen carried responsibilities, to myself to remain honest, to my family to keep conversation open, to the friends whose boundaries I had to honor. As the year unfurled, choices became less about hiding and more about steering. I experimented with pronouns in measured circles, gauged reactions, and adjusted my pace when the world pushed too hard. There were victories that felt like odes. A school assembly where I spoke briefly about kindness and inclusion, parents who reached out with tentative questions that led to dialogue, a teacher who posted a classroom sign that read, "Respect everyone's name." There were also losses. A friendship that drifted when the distance between us proved too large, an aunt's silence that tasted like disappointment. Both kinds of loss taught me about the economy of relationships and the selective generosity of people. Through it all, the mirror remained. It had been a portal into courage, a repository of memory, and a witness to gradual change. Sometimes I would stand before it and see traces of my old self braided into my new one. Other times I saw just the person I was becoming, unmoored from expectation. The bracelet on my wrist had become less of a relic and more of a token, not a symbol of completion but of progress. I learned to speak to my reflection not just in rehearsal but in reassurance. "You are enough. You are allowed to change." Those phrases lodged into my bones like small seeds. One evening, months after that first kitchen conversation, Mom and I sat at the table with tea cooling between our hands. There was a kind of fatigue that comes from hard early work, but also an ease that surprised me. She looked up and, with a seriousness that carried a smile, asked, Are you happy? The question was simple and enormous. I thought of the bus rides and the shopping trips, the supportive texts and the whispered insults, the counselor's notes and the new friendships. I answered slowly because honesty now felt sacred. Yes. Mostly. Some days are still hard. But yes. She reached across and squeezed my hand. In that small compression there was history and future braided. An apology for not seeing sooner, a promise to try, a mutual vow to move forward. There were no thunderclaps after that, no miraculous transformations, only the patient labor of living authentically in a world that asks a price for deviation. But I found in the quiet places that the cost was not always as steep as fear had forecast. People adjusted. Some left, some stayed. Some surprised me by the grace of their acceptance. I grew attuned to the way identity is negotiated daily. A conversation between self and world that requires courage, patience, and sometimes forgiveness. The mirror, ever present, became less a tribunal and more a companion that tracked those small shifts. A softer jawline when I smiled, a steadier stance in my shoulders, a tiny flourish of self-respect that crept into the way I walked. I still sometimes woke at night with the old question lodged under my sternum, a sharp phantom worry about parental meetings and distant relatives and imagined slurs. But those nights receded more quickly, soothed by routines and by the knowledge that Mom had, in her way, chosen to stand with me. Our relationship reconfigured itself not as a denial of difference but as an accommodation of love. In private I would touch the bracelet, look at the sticky note on the mirror that read, "You are my child," and feel the arc of my life bend toward possibility. There's a moment I remember with a clarity that feels almost cinematic. A school talent show where I read a short piece about self-discovery. I sat on the stage, a single spotlight warming the page in my hands. The audience was a constellation of faces, some kind, some puzzled, some indifferent. As I read, I felt the words roll off my tongue with the texture of truth. And when I finished, the applause was uneven but real. Mom was there in the audience, eyes bright, and afterwards she hugged me as if every mile we'd walked had been worth the trembling. The mirror at home later reflected a face that had been tested and found resolute. I felt pride, not the boastful kind, but the deep, private pride of someone who had navigated fear and found a way to stand. The story did not end in neat resolution. There are chapters still unwritten. Conversations with relatives to come. Future days when my confidence will ebb. Periods when I will seek counsel anew. But what changed was the axis of my life, the center around which choices now turned. I had learned that identity can be both fragile and fierce, that acceptance can come in small parcels and sometimes in grand gestures, and that a mother's question, "Why?" can open a space where truth grows. I keep the bracelet tucked beside my mirror. It scratches a quiet testimony to endurance. When I brush past its edges in the dark, it reminds me of that kitchen and the afternoon when a simple cardboard box cracked open our guarded life. If someone asked me now what the most important discovery had been, I would say that being seen is terrifying, that being seen is freeing, and that love can learn its way forward if given the chance. The mirror still fogs sometimes, but now I smile into the blur, knowing that even imperfect reflections are part of a life being made.